My name is Lee Lane. I'm a visiting fellow at Hudson Institute. I want to begin by thanking Ken Weinstein for actually giving us this forum, and also our three very distinguished panelists. The way that we will proceed this afternoon is that the opening remarks after my brief introduction will be presented by Peter Grossman. Peter is the Clarence Ephraimson Professor of Economics at Butler University. Peter is also the author of U.S. Energy Policy and the Pursuit of Failure, which in some ways is the background for this whole session. Commenting on Peter's presentation today, which will focus on the question that is the center of this particular session, bipartisan energy policy, the solution or the problem, commenting will be first Chris DeMuth, Distinguished Fellow at Hudson Institute, and second, David Montgomery, Senior Vice President at NERA Economic Consulting. All three of our panelists are scholars who have thought and written and researched deeply on the questions of energy and environmental policy. They all have extensive experience in public policy dealing with energy issues. Peter has actually written several books on the subject. And it turns out that our two commenters also have worked. I think we actually have all four worked kind of through the same period on these issues and have a fairly extensive personal memory, as well as having done some research on the subject. I noted from Chris DeMuth's bio that he was in the White House kind of just before what Peter kind of begins as the beginning of the modern era of energy policy, which is 1973. And then Chris was at OIRA in the early 1980s, right? Right, Chris?
Yes,
and,
Reagan term.
During the Reagan administration, and in some ways the continuation of the winding down of some of the policies that were adopted in the first decade. David Montgomery has served in both the executive and the legislative branches of government on energy policy, having worked in the Energy Information Administration and the Congressional Budget Office at various times of his career. So we have an extremely varied panel as far as their backgrounds are concerned. You've got bios in your packages, so I won't do any more introduction than that. And the fundamental format here is a very simple one. Peter is going to speak, and then we'll have comments first from Chris, then from David. We'll probably have a very, very brief round of quick comments of panelists if they want to respond to anything said in the initial remarks. Then we'll turn it over to audience discussion, and then probably some final wrap-up comments at the very end. I wanted to begin by just introducing a few ideas that I hope will emerge from this discussion. This is my only chance to steer things in the direction that I think is most interesting, or among the most interesting things that the panel is going to be discussing. When I looked at Peter Grossman's slides yesterday, slides for this presentation, the thing that really struck me more than anything else was the remarkable continuity of at least one pattern in U.S. energy policy, all the way from 1973 to at least through 2009. And that pattern is fundamentally organized around what Peter calls a narrative, and it's organized around a series of events in which a perceived crisis, usually precipitated by an oil price shock, leads to demands for action from Washington. That produces what I think of as sort of shotgun bipartisanship, in which two rival parties are compelled to cobble together a common piece of legislation, which is composed more or less equally of really bad ideas and out rent seeking. The result has been a series of major energy bills that have, for the most part, shaped energy policy in the United States for the last 40 years. One of the questions that Peter's book repeatedly asks is, and actually we were just talking about this very subject a second ago among ourselves, okay, what market failures are these policy interventions actually supposed to be solving? And one of the things that I think will be interesting if the discussion turns out that way today is that we have in David Montgomery someone who back in the 1970s actually wrote some of the articles that first formulated the arguments about the supposed market failures associated with petroleum imports. And I think it's, even though we've been debating this question since the 1970s, I think it would be very interesting to have both David and Peter discuss the question of just what we currently believe about whether there are valid market failures, and assuming that they are, how important are they in a quantitative sense? With all of this continuity, and I guess this was really the thing that struck me, with all of the continuity in the way energy policy is being made, and what I think are the rather unfortunate results, outcomes of our policy process, a tremendous amount has changed in the way the U.S. government actually operates, and a tremendous amount has changed in U.S. society. So we have this continuity, but it's in the midst of a great deal of change in other things. And this was my hope in inviting Chris to take part in this panel. I know he has been thinking about exactly these same sorts of subjects, and I think the question that occurs to me is how have the changes in American government affected the changes in the energy policy process, and what can we expect in the future as a result of the interaction of this very stable pattern of policy episodes and these quite significant changes in the way governance actually works. It seems that what's happened in the policy process is not primarily driven by changes in formal institutions. I think there's been some of that, but the bigger changes have actually been in informal norms. That is to say, the bigger changes have been in what the public and the policymakers themselves expect government behavior to do, and what norms it will conform to. At least four such changes, I think, are dramatic and important. First, parties are now ideologically more homogeneous, and both of the parties have at least somewhat drawn ideologically away from the median voter. Secondly, congressional leadership in both houses of Congress is more centralized by a significant margin than it was in 1970 or 73 at the beginning of the period that Peter discusses in depth. Third, there's certainly been a shift in the relative power in which the White House and but the executive branch more generally has gained in power in comparison with the legislative branch of Congress. And finally, fourth and finally, the balanced budget norm, which was already weakened at the beginning of this period, has, I think, largely disappeared as an effective factor in national politics. There's one other change that is not directly related to governance that I think is another change in norms that, as far as energy policy is concerned, it doesn't have the broader significance for all U.S. government, but as far as energy policy, the change in the nature of environmentalism is, I think, a large difference between our period today and the early days of the oil price shocks of the 1970s. The environmental movement had, of course, already arisen as a major, significant political force in 1973. But I would argue that environmentalism has itself changed. First, since the rise of the climate change issue beginning in the late 1980s and then early 1990s, energy policy became not an issue of the environmental movement. It became the number one, the prime issue of American environmentalism. Secondly, as part of that, I think the green groups and their allied rent seekers have managed to persuade the public and a lot of elite opinion that green energy, renewables, and conservation are able at this point in their current stage of development to bear a lot more of the burden of energy supply than I think is the case. And that fact has made a rational discussion of fossil fuel policy very much more difficult than it was back in the 1970s. Third, the green movement has become an all but official part of the Democratic Party, and its strength as an element in Democratic politics has greatly increased over what it was in the 1970s. And fourth, and admittedly in this part of the presentation, I am definitely stating my own views and infusing my own value judgments. I think it is pretty clear that the green movement, while it has made climate change their number one policy priority area, has no viable or even plausible path to solving the problem of climate change. This is a subject that David Montgomery and I have written about together, and David has written about separately, and it's another point at which I hope might be covered in David's remarks. So, what are we to make of all of those changed circumstances combined with Peter's very powerful narrative of policy continuity, if we try to look forward and speculate about what future energy policy might resemble? I think there are likely to be some fairly significant differences from the pattern that prevailed in the past. The first of those is simply that the regulatory state is much more powerful than it used to be, and the sorts of big energy bills that used to largely define the course of American energy policy may be less important compared to regulatory change in the future than has been in the past. This is especially true depending on whether the Congress actually succeeds in devising effective constraints on the executive branch regulatory process. I think it's an open question at this point how such constraints might be made to work. They certainly haven't been working in the recent past, but the new situation emerging in this Congress may offer changes in that. The second change that we can only speculate on at this point, I think is an interesting question. Might the revolution in shale gas and light tight oil development actually shift the power balance in energy politics in the United States? In other words, what are the political implications of the shale gas and light tight oil development? So far, I would say that the effects have not had much effect on the relative strength of the pro-fossil fuel versus pro-renewable energy coalitions, advocacy coalitions. Both have been strengthened, but the net effect has been relatively modest. I'm not sure that that will continue to be the case in the future. And furthermore, if it changes, I'm not sure in which direction it's going to change. However, that being said, my guess is that we have by no means seen the end of crude oil price shocks. The world market still has many sources of exogenous shocks available to change it. And if we get another price shock, I don't see that the political process has changed, and some of the manifestations of the response may differ from those that we've seen in the past. But I would suspect that the basic outlines that Peter has described in the past are likely to repeat themselves in some variation in the future. But that is the point that Peter has really addressed in great length in his book, and it is also, I believe, the thrust of his remarks here today. So, Peter.
Thank you. Let me just say at the outset, first of all, I wanted to thank Lee for having this opportunity for me. I have to tell you that I have a minor neurological issue that means that my eyes blink a lot, and it's hard for me, especially with bright lights, to keep focus on anything. Sometimes my eyes will close involuntarily for a brief period. It's supposedly hereditary, though my own view is that it probably is the result of reading the congressional record, and now that my book is done, I probably won't have to read it so much. Maybe I'll be cured. I think that actually the clicker is that where. Could you pass that over?
I think this.
Yes. Well, of course, it's okay. I mean, I realize you're, but whatever. Is it going to disrupt? Okay. Now, I want to, besides thanking Lee for setting this up, thank the Hudson Institute for holding this, and thank all of you for having come to hear it. This topic is bipartisanship, and it's taken on a particular, let me see if I got this right here, it's taken on a kind of outsized importance. If only, where is Lyndon Johnson now that we need him? And why can't we have bipartisanship again? Bipartisanship will make it possible for us to solve problems that right now are gridlocked. So the bright light would be the day that bipartisanship resumes. But we've had a great deal of bipartisanship with respect to energy. This is a list of votes on major energy bills over the years. And you can see that these were really outsized votes that reflected a bipartisan consensus. Now, the one problem is that almost all of those bills were bipartisan and bad. The first one was the Emergency Petroleum Allocation Act, which piled government allocation controls on government price controls. The next one was the bill that was passed in the Ford administration, which was a grab bag of things and wasn't very effective. The windfall profits tax, of course, was something that lasted for about 6 or 7 years. By 1986, when it was projected to be producing billions of dollars a year, it produced exactly zero. And that's one of the cases in which the government actually repealed an act that they had passed. A number of these are still on the books. The Synthetic Fuels Corporation, of course, Synfuels was, the bill was going to cost $88 billion, which is in inflation-adjusted terms over $200 billion today. And that one was also very much a bipartisan bill. So was the 1992 Comprehensive Energy Policy Act, which was not very comprehensive. But that's the one that gave us the production tax credit for wind, which has been used much more in recent times than it was then. And of course, it also gave us a very important other component, which was that set the amount of water that you could use per flush in new toilets. And I don't know exactly how that was in there, but those are the kinds of things you find in these bills. And finally, we have the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007, which was primarily the ethanol mandate. And that has been, that was a very big bipartisan. The signing ceremony was a love fest between George Bush and Nancy Pelosi. And they both said about how this was going to really make a huge difference. And both of them expected that by dint of passage of the bill, we would have cellulosic ethanol in commercial quantities by 2012. Bush had given it 6 years in 2006 in his State of the Union address. And that kind of hubris in government energy programs has been ubiquitous since the 1970s. Not only did we announce that we would have 2 million barrels a day of synthetic fuel, but we also were going to have breeder reactors by 1980. And in 1980, we passed the Magnetic Fusion Electrical Engineering Act, if I'm MFE, I can remember it by, which was almost hysterically funny in terms of what it was said it was going to do. It was, first of all, it was touted by Jim Wright in Congress as being something like the catalyst of the next creation of fire. And it was passed unanimously, but primarily because it had no actual money appropriated to it. It was by 2001, we would have a working magnetic fusion electricity plant that was going to be a commercial prototype. One of the interesting things, by the way, about that was that they didn't have anything in the bill about laser fusion because that was actually handled by a different branch of government. So in other words, we had two fusion programs to create fusion electrical generation, and they weren't even in the they weren't really talking to each other. Now, as I said, these were examples of bipartisan bad for the most part, and they were based on often flawed and even absurd predictions. The forecasts about energy that have gone on for the last 50 years have been just so outlandish. They've never really absorbed the statement by, who was it? I think Herb Stein was one of the people who said it, was that if a trend is unsustainable, it will stop. But instead they projected trends forever, and they assumed that nothing would change and nobody would change their behavior. And so these kinds of forecasts were underneath some of the energy legislation that was passed in the 70s and the 90s and even 2000s. But they almost all of them were passed during or in the immediate aftermath of what was perceived to be an energy crisis, when policymakers were motivated by what I've called the do something dilemma, in which they have to actually act or at least be seen to be doing something in order to solve a problem that was making constituents particularly uncomfortable. The fact is that no government measure ever got us out of one of these energy crises. But all of them ended because essentially things like price spikes lead to reactions in markets that lead to resolution. All of them have been solved that way. Now, solved permanently, solved beautifully? No. But no government action ever actually brought us out of any of this. And that was the reason that we were passing these bills in the first place. Now, the question, though, that Lee raised before about market failure is something, of course, I treat in my book at great length, because throughout the period, all administrations say that the only reason for government interventions is the markets are failing. What exactly was the market failure that we were viewing here? Well, in the 1970s, it wasn't market failure at all. It was government price controls that were causing things like gas lines. Later on, though, or even then, part of the failure argument was that the markets didn't have enough foresight. They couldn't see that oil and gas were disappearing rapidly. Carter believed that by the late 1980s, no countries except for OPEC countries would have any oil or gas left, any kind of reasonably attainable, reasonably exploitable deposits, resources. So, in fact, what happened was they wanted to steer the world in a direction, or America at least, in a direction that they thought was necessary, and that the market was failing because it didn't seem to recognize this. I can't tell you the number of times that I read in the research that I did for my book that, well, the reason we have to do this is because the markets won't do it. The markets just can't foresee. But the markets were saying, well, maybe it's not so bad. At least when they were allowed to operate after 1980, actually after 1990, because in the 1980s, all the way through the 1980s, we still had price controls on natural gas. Oil price controls were dropped within, I think, the first day of the Reagan administration. Although by that time, Carter had been in favor of oil price deregulation as well. But throughout the 70s, there was no way in which you could talk about a market failure in a world in which the government controlled allocations and controlled prices. In miniature, it was Eastern Europe. and a shortage economy that existed in all of the Warsaw Pact countries. Now, the bills that were passed, though, not only sought to get rid of or to solve a particular market failure or to solve a particular energy crisis, they contained often proposals, and sometimes very broad proposals or specific proposals, for something that was going to cure energy problems once and for all. We were going to make X, the government was going to make X, synfuels, fusion, breeder reactors, and it would solve, and because it would allow us to have enough oil substitute or electricity for 100 years, 500 years, 10 million years. It was always couched in these panacea terms. And of course, they also became pork fests, especially in the 21st century. The 2005 bill was over 1,700 pages long. The 2007 bill, I think, was about 1,200 pages, something like that, 1,100 pages. And believe me, it wasn't just simply a one or two kinds of programs. Now, one of the real issues that's never really discussed, in fact, going back to the Nixon administration, as soon as they see an energy problem, they think, well, what kind of program, what kind of technology should we use to change this? And they don't really ask the first basic question. Why do we need a national energy policy in the first place? And what comes out of it is not so much a real answer to this question, but an interpretation of events. What I call the America's energy narrative that started in 1973. And the energy crises of the 1970s proved that we were dangerously, I can't tell you the number of times that appears, dangerously dependent on foreign oil, especially from unstable regions of the world. By the way, I'll get to the by the way in a little bit. That we were running out of oil and gas ourselves, and so was everybody else, except OPEC. Even Russia was going to be running out of oil and gas by around 1990. In fact, there was a State Department paper that said something along the lines of, here's our projections for oil and gas and so on over the next decade. This is in around 1980. And said, unless the administration is right, in which case, in 1990, the world comes to an end. And soon demand for oil would outstrip supply. This has been a familiar theme over the years. Somehow demand and supply were not going to catch up to each other, and there would be no way they would equilibrate over time. This is an economic non sequitur, or an oxymoron, maybe both. And that as a result, we'd get a permanent supply-demand gap that would give warning, and this is something from the Carter administration in particular, that the end of the age of oil was at hand. It's been at hand now for a long time. But the good news in all of this was if dependency was the problem, there's an obvious solution: energy independence. Although, what is energy independence? Well, energy independence is complete self-sufficiency, right? Well, no, it's capability of complete self-sufficiency, temporary self-sufficiency, invulnerability. That was a favorite in the Ford administration. A diversified group of suppliers. By the way, by that measure, we've been energy independent for over 20 years, 30 probably. And then we have some more, just no more oil, no more OPEC, no Western just NAFTA, Canadian oil imports. energy value must equal of imports must equal exports, etc. These are ones I've counted. I think I've counted altogether about 17 by this time of what energy independence means. Well, if there's 17 different definitions, it's essentially meaningless as a goal. The ambiguity is much greater than any kind of policy could possibly encompass. And complete self-sufficiency is not a very wise choice. It would make us less energy secure, not more, and would also raise costs considerably. I have a friend who says if anybody wants to know about the viability and usefulness of energy independence, they should think about Romania under Ceausescu, which was energy independent. So unfortunately, that was not very good for the Romanian people. Now, this is a little bit cynical on my part, but I do believe that most politicians, energy independence means that their constituents won't get angry at them anymore because the gas prices are too high. But since energy measures have been based on this narrative, how much of the narrative is actually true, especially now? Well, none of it. But it was true then? No. It was not really true even in the 1970s. Obviously, the world and the U.S. were not running out of fossil fuels. OPEC, it turns out, is much more dependent on selling us their oil than we are on buying it. The idea that there was going to be more embargoes, which, by the way, there are an awful lot of papers that were written in the 1970s about how every OPEC country, not just the Arabs, but every OPEC country is going to find an embargo just too tantalizing to avoid. They'll stick it to somebody, and that way they'll get their way and change their behavior and so on. But from the standpoint of the OPEC countries, do you know how many embargoes have we had since? Well, basically none, because it was a complete fiasco. Almost everything that the Arabs hoped for out of the oil embargo not only didn't happen, the opposite happened. They wanted to influence American public opinion. They did. We became much more pro-Israel than we had been. They were depicted as the villains and so on and so forth. But why did the politicians embrace this narrative and maintain their embrace to this day? Well, the do something dilemma. They had to do something in the midst of constituent suffering back in the 1970s. They had to be seen to be doing something. And the narrative seemed to reflect the facts. In the 1976, when John O'Leary was appointed to be or named that he would be the head of the Federal Energy Administration, the precursor to the Department of Energy, he was asked about natural gas, and he said, natural gas has had it. We're not going to find any more. And in fact, one of the things that the Carter administration did was to ban the use of natural gas as well as oil in the production of electric power. And so everything was going to be coal was going to be about the only acceptable means of producing energy, which of course today for environmentalists would be an anathema. It also had identifiable bad guys, and it offered a simple sounding answer to a complex problem. Energy independence. We'll be free. And everybody could decide what that meant. I can't tell you the number of people who say, well, it just means we won't buy from people we don't like. They don't really, I said, when was the last time you had a made-in label on the gas you were pumping into your car? So you knew exactly where it was from. Anyway, but the political virtues of the energy independence trope, to me, are, it sounds bold and decisive, can mean almost anything, take years. Any of these solutions, any of the ones where people say, well, this is what we need to do to be energy independent, things like the Synfuels bill was not going to really reach its peak for 12 years. That 6 that's 3 presidential election cycles, 2 senatorial election cycles, and 6 congressional House Representatives cycles. So it's really very convenient to point to this golden moment in the future. We'll be energy independent, whatever that means. And there are no other ideas on the table that could capture the imagination, soothe constituents. I mean, some of the ideas on the table were things like raising taxes. That was not something that people really wanted to hear. And a few other things like that, rationing that would be really onerous. People didn't want to hear that either. So it also is part of what sometimes referred to as policy inheritance, or also path dependency, that you have this kind of somebody seizes the rhetorical high ground. In this case, it was Richard Nixon, and nobody really seems to realize that it makes no sense. And in fact, the Democrats in Congress at the time said not that this was really impractical and ambiguous to begin with. They said, hey, we thought of it first, and we were going to have bigger budgets, and we were going to get there faster. And of course, they've all used it since. Obama, as recently as last month, talked about energy independence. Path dependency is another. Early events, it's been pointed out, matter much more than later ones, and particular course of action once introduced is very hard to reverse, especially when it's politically popular. And that's, in fact, what my next slide says, especially when it's politically popular. So, but have there been any, some people ask me, they say, well, you know, I'm so negative, they tell me, that do you really think the government has done anything, can do anything useful in energy? And of course, part of it is this, I guess, is the effect of bipartisan policies here of removing things that were not very effective, like the windfall profits tax, price controls, allocation controls, and the defunding of some programs that were touted as being solutions to our energy dilemmas forever and ever. And there's more things that they could repeal. The RFS, for example, the ethanol mandate is something that I would love to see go, and so would a lot of people, but it has a very strong constituency. I'd like to see the end of all commercialization subsidy programs, although maintenance of R&D programs. And in fact, when I was doing interviews for my book on radio, people would ask me, so what do you think the government can do effectively? So I'd start saying, well, I think that one thing is, and I'd get through a professorial rambling for about a minute. They said, well, thank you very much, and I wouldn't have gotten through a third of it. And so I had to come up with something snappy, and I came up with the 4 I's. Ideas, R&D, institutions, rules, so that rules aren't holding things back. There's so many jurisdictions in energy issues that very often it's very difficult to make any kind of continuity in energy programs. Infrastructure. One can argue about whether or not you want to see the government owning all the pipelines and being in charge of the grid. But in fact, they are in charge of the grid, and they do control the pipelines. And Keystone is this big story about how we, going to have this pipeline that was going to run from Canada all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. I can't remember the number now. It's something like 2 million miles of pipeline, oil and gas pipeline underneath the ground in the United States. From that standpoint, Keystone is just a little blip. And not only that, some of those pipelines, as I understand it, are in desperate need of repair and upgrading. Finally, information. I think the EIA has been a very useful addition to the in terms of I used it extensively while writing my book and use it for papers and so on. Although I must say that one review in one of the libertarian publications said that I was wrong. Government shouldn't do any of these, I think, but certainly not information. But it's not likely, though, because it appears that policymakers have learned nothing from the past. I'm not sure I really wanted to put it quite so bluntly, because there's one thing they learn is what's politically viable. But policy has failed, though, is irrelevant to each new Congress and each new presidential administration. Each one, I mean, when President Obama became president, he came in with the exact same prescriptions that had been done before. He just said we need to do more of them. One of the things sometimes that happens in government is when a policy fails, the argument is, we just didn't try hard enough. I'm reminded of this scene from a World War I movie where they go over the trench and Kirk Douglas is leading them across no man's land. They're getting slaughtered and they all fall back into the trench, and he's standing there, just one more time, at which point like 5 bodies come flying and knocking him back into the trench. But we're still one more time. This time we'll do it. Just have to mass enough people on no man's land. And it's as if officials are saying they know their ideas will fail, but they'll pursue them anyway because they can't think of anything else to do. And I think there's something to that, at least in the context of picking up an idea for how you solve an energy crisis, which may or may not even be something that you can solve. So I'll end here with they'll pursue a course of action that sounds pleasing to voters. They will willfully pursue failure, and that we'll have to do. And I suppose I should be like a friend of mine who's also an energy guy who he always starts out his talks with his latest book in his hand, and he says, "Here's my latest book. You don't have to read it. You only have to buy it." Matt, thank you.
Get your computer, yeah. So I just press, yeah.
I think you should turn the light back on it.
The theme of Peter's book and talk, Bipartisanship and the Pursuit of Failure, reminds me of the classic account of the nature of bipartisanship. We have in America, as you know, a two-party system. We have two parties. One is the stupid party and the other is the evil party, and we know who they are. And most of the time, the parties are going about in very partisan fashion, pursuing their special knack for and interest in stupidity on the one hand and evil on the other. But occasionally an issue comes before the nation that is so grave and momentous that the two parties come together in a spirit of crisis and bipartisan resolve and do something that is both stupid and evil. Before I get to the subject of this book and the issues that Lee Lane has raised for me, I want to mention that the book is really marvelous and an exemplary piece of policy scholarship in that it combines an exposition of economics and an exposition of institutions and policy and political history. Economists have powerful tools at their disposal. They can analyze markets and the idiosyncrasies of particular ones, such as in energy markets, the problems of establishing property rights over underground pools and of natural monopoly in aspects of electricity distribution and of externalities in production and consumption. And Peter works through all of these with great proficiency, and it's all very, very edifying. But because economists have these great tools and they can actually solve problems up on a blackboard, they are frequently loath to undertake the painstaking and often dreary work of examining the vagaries of policy history, the actual operation of political institutions. Those who do study and write about such things, historians, political scientists, and journalists, are often very shaky or even worse in understanding the economics behind the dramas that they are relating. Good policy analysis has to do both, and this is a rare and exemplary example of it. I particularly like Peter's technique whereby in the midst of a narrative of this or that presidential speech or congressional bill or task force, another task force report, suddenly the impartial spectator, Peter's economic conscience, a sort of a Jiminy Cricket with a PhD, suddenly pops up to point out that what is being said or proposed is utter economic nonsense. So if Jimmy Carter believes that the earth is rapidly running out of oil, Jiminy Cricket interrupts to explain that if that is indeed the case, what he's proposing to do is going to be bound to make matters much worse. And then we're back to the narrative. The modern phase of the March of Folly related in the Grossman book begins in the early 1970s, in the years just before the 73-74 Arab oil embargo. That was also the beginning of the era of wholesale policy delegation from Congress to the executive agencies, a trend that has continued down to the present and is much in the news this year and even this week. Lee asked me to consider the evolution of energy policy in light of those changes, and I do have a few thoughts. The first is that Peter Grossman's book is a comprehensive refutation of the formal theory of policy delegation, which is the theory of Woodrow Wilson progressivism. That theory was and remains that Congress is too parochial, uninformed, and cumbersome to deal with the complex, technologically challenging problems of the modern economy and society, and that the solution must be to turn policy matters over to disinterested administrators and professional specialists, people in the possession of expertise being organized, objective knowledge, and with the flexibility that they have to apply that knowledge as managers to complex, nuanced, ever-changing real-world problems. And yet what comes through in every page of Peter's book is that the executive officials and agencies have been from moment to moment fully as deluded as people in the Congress, and consistently so. Both senior presidents, cabinet officers, senior officials, agency staffs have been just as inclined as members of Congress and congressional staff to translate transient political pressures into world historic crises, to describing the crises in terms of simple dramas with good guys and bad guys, and good and evil to be subdued and defeated, and just as given to first impossible goals, impossible to achieve goals, such as energy self-sufficiency, which will be achieved usually just several years beyond the expected tenures of the people who are proposing them, and just as inclined to embrace deep logical inconsistencies, the result of the obligation of government officials to pander to their constituencies, such as most glaringly throughout the book, the insistence that what we need to do is to conserve energy, to encourage exploration for new and alternative sources, and at the same time, above everything else, to keep prices low. There is some division of labor between the executive and the legislature that I see in the book. Congress is clearly more prone to pork barrel spending, to accommodating regulatory rent-seeking by various extremely narrow interests. Executive officials from presidents on down are more prone for crisis thinking, apocalyptic scenarios, moralizing, hyperbole, and grandiose plans of redemption. Those seem to be executive specialties. But the tendencies do not, in Peter's telling, at least as I read Peter, the tendencies do not offset each other, but rather complement and magnify each other. We do not have checks and balances, but rather synergies between the ways that the two political branches approach problems such as we've seen in the energy area. When executive agencies do deploy real expertise, such as in detailed studies of energy markets and specific projections of upcoming oil and gas supply, demand, and prices, they are invariably wrong, and often spectacularly so. When they set specific goals and deadlines, such as for energy self-sufficiency, commercial deployment of breeder reactors, demonstration models of hydrogen fuel cell automobiles, the goals and the steps for achieving them are derived not from science, not from objective study of any sort, but from a combination of politics and marketing, speech writing ideas. Sometimes these are, as Peter says more than once, seem to be just pulled out of the air. And these shortcomings afflict executive branch officials who actually are experts. Two of those who come off pretty badly in the Grossman account are James Schlesinger, who was an eminent economist, think tanker, who did very, very good work, and Glenn Seaborg, a Nobel laureate chemist. He even had an element named after him, Seaborgium, one that even Tom Lehrer couldn't rhyme. But these people are just as mistaken, just as prone to politics, to wishful thinking, to exaggeration in their roles as executive branch officials. And they and others bring along with them the staffs of putatively expert agencies such as the Council of Economic Advisors and the Office of Management and Budget. Most of all, there is no evidence throughout this long story, more than 40 years now, of learning by doing, of progressive improvement in knowledge. No more of that in the executive branch than in the Congress, which is inherently a transient and changing agency. If there's anything that defines real expertise, it is the accumulation of knowledge over time. And in the period of time that Peter is investigating, since in the modern era, since about 1970, we've seen real expertise in energy. We've seen fantastic improvements in our understanding of energy science and engineering and even economics, which Peter takes us through. But the government seems to make the same mistakes over and over again. My conclusion is that the executive branch is not, in fact, above the political fray, that the idea of disinterested, that the progressive ideal of disinterested administrators saving us from democratic politics is an illusion, that the executive branch is different from, but it is down in the weeds of politics just as much as the Congress is. The real impetus for delegation from Congress to the executive branch, as I read Peter's book, is to resolve political dilemmas. in particular the demand to do something, but not to do too much of something, not to discommode one's own constituents. When the circumstances have been defined as a crisis and something has to be done, the political representative has to call upon reform. We have to reform some important aspect of the economy of our society, but the economy and society that are to be reformed are in fact the constituencies that put the elected officials there and who frequently do not want to be reformed. They're quite happy if things go on just as they are. And so the solution is, well, let me give you an example. If we went back to the early 1970s, and there was talk of this even then, if what we wanted to do was to encourage conservation, if we wanted to encourage externality, reducing efficiencies in oil and other energy production and consumption, if we wanted to stimulate the search for alternative sources of energy, there was a pretty straightforward answer at hand, and that was an appropriately designed broad tax on carbon or on petroleum of some sort. But such a tax would have resulted in the immediate dismissal of anybody who voted for it at the next available election. The legislators knew this, and their solution was to pass bills that had all of those desiderata in the first paragraph as the purposes and putative results of the legislation they were passing, but to leave the actual navigation of the shoals, the actual decisions on costs and benefits to executive branch management through such things as regulation, the CAFE standards being an ideal example, to achieve conservation not through incentives but actually working against people's incentives, but doing so in a way, as CAFE has proven to be, that is extreme, that is on the one hand, to the extent it achieves anything, results in higher prices that are not blamed on the government but look like they are prices coming from private parties for the services and goods that they are selling. And secondly, that are extremely porous. They have many, many loopholes in them that people can, in this case, literally drive through. By the way, the 75 Act that Professor Grossman mentioned that instituted the CAFE standards also tightened, that is, lowered the prices, the controlled prices for petroleum. I have been part of one effort to apply expertise in the service of improving the results of regulatory policies and other policies of the executive branch, and that is the use of cost-benefit analysis as a standard by which to measure regulation. And this is going beyond Peter's book, but in my experience, the cost-benefit test has been wholly, there are areas of policy where it has been effective, but in the energy policy area, and especially when it comes to the automobile and appliance efficiency standards, it has been utterly worthless, and in fact has had some perverse effects in that it has come to be used as a tool for promoting outrageously paternalistic and ineffective regulations, such as the latest round of appliance energy efficiency standards of the Energy Department during the current administration, where if you look at the headline numbers setting new standards for things like dishwashers and washing machines and air conditioners, so that people in Houston and people in Presque Isle, Maine have to have exactly the same air conditioners and other appliances. That these standards are going to produce massive benefits. In fact, I think early in the Obama administration, the benefits were almost as big as the stimulus program. If you looked at the numbers of the billions of dollars that would be showered upon us as a result of these standards. In fact, the externality reducing and the supposed foreign energy dependence reducing results of these standards was extremely low, and not even a fraction of what everybody agreed would be the costs. The benefits were going to come from forcing people to make wise decisions that they would otherwise be too stupid to make in spending more on more expensive appliances today in exchange for some estimate of reduced expenditures on electricity in the future. Very easy to refute those numbers, but it is sheer paternalism. And if you go to the Energy Department or EPA websites today, EPA in the case this week of its new ozone standards, you will see that their cost-benefit analyses show ratios of 3 or 4 to 1. So every dollar we're spending is going to produce an immediate value of $3 or $4 from, say, these very expensive new and tightened ozone standards. So in a way, cost-benefit analysis, this use of expertise has also been twisted in imaginative ways to provide to provide support for what are clearly political initiatives. Let me say a final word about the current environment. It's as has been mentioned, the spate of omnibus bills has sort of come to a halt. I think that an important turning point here and an important episode in the migration of real policy power from the legislature to the executive branch was the defeat in the Congress. In fact, it was in the Democratic Senate during President Obama's first term of his and the Democratic leadership's proposals for a national cap and trade program to control carbon dioxide, methane, other greenhouse gases. This did not, in the final throes of the negotiations, look like an economic incentive property rights plan that an economist would approve of for controlling any particular externality, but was shot through with special favors and lures for this group and that. But in the end, they found it impossible to come up with anything that met all of the political requisites, and the negotiations collapsed. Whereupon the EPA, which had already, at the end of the Bush administration, begun working on efforts to use the Clean Air Act, a wholly unsuitable vehicle for putting together a national greenhouse gas program, lurched into gear and is now very, very well along. It's been up to the Supreme Court twice now, and it is pretty clear that in the case of the greenhouse gas controls, the ozone controls, other aspects of EPA policies, the beneath the subtext of all of this is to hobble the fossil fuel economy as much as possible to make room for others. I do think that it's going to look a little bit different in the next couple of years than it has during most of the 40 years past that Professor Grossman's book tells us about. And it is because we are now going to be in a period of fully divided government. It's sort of a rarity. We had it at the end of the Clinton years. So I don't think we will see the sorts of bipartisan follies that we've seen in the past. I believe that the Congress regulation is difficult to control with the spending power because so much of it is done through just the financing is all out there in the private sector. And you can make regulations by email and guidance documents now People know what the enforcing agency will do if you do this, do that. You can affect people's behavior pretty powerfully with the prospective criminal sanction. I think that Congress will try to use the Congressional Review Act to countermand some aspects of EPA regulation. Those attempts have failed, including in the Republican House in the past, and it's a little difficult to predict with the presidential election coming up, doing things that seem to be anti-environment, seem to be global warming denying, may lose some of their magic. A big increase in oil prices could affect that calculus. I believe that in a time of fully divided government, we're certainly not going to see big national legislation, but I think that the powers of the executive branch, with all of the authorities it has accumulated, are going to prove protean and are going to produce some unexpected results. A lot of the movement is now going to go to the states. Just as under the Affordable Care Act, where it was clear that nothing was going to change legislatively in Washington, much of it, of Obamacare deployment has turned on the extent to which the federal agencies can coerce, cajole, coax the states into coming on board in one way or another. That's clearly the purpose of EPA's Clean Air Act proposals for and now actual initiatives, regulations on greenhouse gas. Nobody at EPA wants to really try to use the Clean Air Act with its state implementation plans and so forth to address greenhouse gases. They all understand that it won't work. What they can do is make it look so painful for states that the prospect of waivers, which they're already holding out, for states that introduce their own cap and trade programs for within states can be pretty attractive. And in 2 years, it is possible. It's not necessarily, I don't think it's baked in. It will be an interesting drama. But I think it is possible to get California, a couple of other states, New York, for example, to institute their own programs, which in ways such as California's regulation of automobile vehicles can export some of their costs to other states and bring other states on board. So I think that the drama will be in the executive branch and its relationship with the sovereign states. One last thing. One cannot look at this the story that Professor Grossman tells without being impressed that energy. This book might be able to be written about financial regulation or telecommunications regulation, and it would have the story would look very similar. I think that energy is worse, and I think it has been worse because of this idea that began in the early 1970s that we're running out of it, that the lights are actually going to go out, that the wells are going to be dry, that we really are facing hard limits. And I think that the politics of dividing up the pie, a shrinking pie, as opposed to trying to grow the pie for everybody, has been particularly vicious and harmful in the area of energy policy. I think that as I read the book, the one lesson I take away from is pro-growth is a great political strategy. It's not Professor Grossman's efficiency, but the notion that a growing economy will be good for everyone solves many problems in democratic institutions. And we are now possibly in something like that world. I don't think many people are worried too much about oil running out. We have had some oil price spikes in the past couple of years that have not produced the panics that we have in the past. There's a prospect of a much greater diversification in fossil fuel supplies than we have had in the past. I think that relieving that constraint, this sick worry in one's gut that civilization is really coming to an end. I think that relieving that has been important for reducing some of the harms of energy policy. The Green Movement clearly wants to recover this idea of imminent disaster with the climate change idea. That's the new running out of oil idea. I don't think that it is working. I don't think it has nearly that potential. So that I think that the prospects. I don't think we're going to abolish the Energy Department or do away with all sorts of state and federal subsidies for this or that appealing green initiative. But I think that if we can sustain the idea that energy is in fact abundant, that the price system is one that can cope with it, and keep energy and coming and civilization proceeding, is one that can lead to somewhat better outcomes than the one we have seen in this book. Thank you very much.
David, would you go ahead?
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for your comments.
Thank you. Well, again, I want to echo both Peter and Chris in several ways. The first is in thanking Lee for organizing this fascinating topic, and for you for being here so late on a Friday afternoon. Hope we can keep it lively for the next 40 minutes or so. And coming last puts me in the position of being able to reflect on both what Peter and Chris have said. And for the most part, I found myself agreeing with it and thinking, yes, I wish I had said that. Or I was intending to say that.
You were going to say that.
Yes. But at the very end of Chris's talk, he took a direction which is not the one that I would have taken. So that, I think, is what I'm going to concentrate on for a few minutes. Peter's book, I think, first struck me as being a very, very good history. In fact, I thought I was reading the story of my life, because I started in Washington working on these issues in about 1975. The first thing I wrote at the Congressional Budget Office was a study of what was wrong with the proposal for a synthetic fuels loan guarantee, and I wrote another paper on that last year. And then a comprehensive kind of history of the oil price control program. And I think it's certainly been an accurate characterization of the nature of energy legislation, the failures of energy legislation, and in particular, the lack of any serious reflection on the appropriate role of government in energy markets, or accurate discussion of the kind of externalities that policies are supposed to be addressing. I would go further and say I've not yet seen an externality associated with energy that wasn't bogus. Now, clearly there are environmental externalities that need to be dealt with, but even the primary externality that's claimed, that is that the United States could reduce the price of oil in world markets by controlling our oil imports, although it is probably true, is not an externality. It's an effort to exercise market power by a country that's a major buyer, which it might or might not be able to pull off, but has never really tried through any of the policies that are supposedly addressing these things. And Peter's discussion of the role of crisis and the way crisis creates a perceived need for legislation, and the association in time of omnibus energy legislation with a perception that there's a crisis, I think is a very important starting point for understanding the legislation. But I think we need more than that in order to understand why it is that the response to the crisis has consistently pursued failure so inexorably. And I don't think this is an intellectual failure. I don't think it's because of an inability to think through the consequences of the policies that had to be adopted in a great rush. And I really don't think it has much to do with a kind of vision of scarcity, though certainly both politicians and pundits have used that to rationalize things. So if it's not an intellectual failure, what is it? Let me give you a hint of where I'm going, because a friend and former college classmate who became a congressman from Colorado and successfully built the current Denver International Airport once commented to me that he didn't fight to get on the Appropriations Committee for the intellectual challenges. I don't think it was the intellectual challenges that have given us this kind of energy policy. We expect to see some kind of failure and success in any area of policy. Some of us expect to see a lot more failure than success, but we don't expect it to be quite so consistently one-sided as it is in energy. So what is it that makes energy policy so special? And I start on this by agreeing with the observation that there's no there, that the energy crises are not something where there is a clearly perceived problem or a set of well-organized approaches to dealing with that problem. That is all true. But if all those externalities are as bogus as I think they are, they provide an open field for doing something else. And that's how I would describe the crisis. The crisis, like Tom Schelling's prominent point, or like a dead carcass out in the plains that attracts all the carnivores and scavengers, gives something to focus on. And what it focuses is the desire to provide constituency service. I think that Senator McCain was absolutely right in what he said, in what Peter quotes him as saying, that one of the recent energy bills could be characterized that ISA or EPAC, no lobbyist left behind. And that has been what energy bills have evolved into. And that, I would argue, is the only thing that Congress actually sees as being worthwhile in them. That if the externalities are bogus, I mean, there's an army of academics and consultants and staff members and lobbyists who will provide a gloss of what the externality is, and they are so good at it that we get bills that are full of duplicative or contradictory measures in terms of any of these actual rationales that they might have, and it doesn't matter at all, because the purpose is that the form and the content, because the actual purpose is to put together a bill in which a number of constituency needs are served. In fact, there are, as in the periods between omnibus energy bills, we see a plethora of solutions building up as people are proposing doing something about renewables, doing something about nuclear energy, doing something about people buying SUVs. So we have these multiplicity of specific solutions looking for a problem. And finally, a crisis comes along, so there's a problem. But the only reason the crisis matters is because it's a hook to hang all of these solutions on. Now, this sounds like just a cynical view of politics, but, well, let me make one more point. Why do we see this in energy? The traditional areas of pork barrel politics have been transportation, agriculture, water. Water has been a wonderful source of pork over the years. I think the reason we notice the importance of crises in energy is because the provision of constituency service happens on a regular basis in transportation. We have a regular cycle of authorization and appropriation for transportation bills. Everybody knows when to come in and start promoting what they want to see money spent on. It's really not that interesting trying to do something to the DOE budget. And part of that is because in energy, constituents are not just looking for traditional patronage. They're not just looking for jobs in their district or, building a road or a courthouse or a waterway. It is a much bigger constituency, and I think this is where some of the intellectual and ideological issues come in. That in the case of energy, sure, there's corporate welfare there and lots of architect engineers and constructors and venture capitalists and great big suppliers of electrical equipment who would like government to set up policies that give them more money and more business. They're certainly there. But it's a much more general thing, and it promotes renewable portfolio standards and fuel economy standards and subsidies for nuclear power and subsidies for wind, not just direct government spending. There are ideologists, some of them billionaires, who give a lot of money to either the leadership or particular members of Congress who want to promote the same kind of policies, but also want to see regulations put into effect, efficiency standards put into effect. And so there's a lot going on in an energy. There are a lot of ways of delivering constituency service in an energy bill that go beyond just the spending money that a transportation bill typically does. Now, so the crisis then becomes the opportunity to give presents and decorate the Christmas tree. Since the holiday doesn't come every December 25th, it comes kind of randomly. It's more like Bilbo Baggins' birthday than it is like Christmas. But let me say, why do I emphasize constituency service so much? It's not just because of a cynical view of politics. I think because since the 1970s, it has provided a very convincing explanation of legislative behavior that I would attribute to a kind of a Stanford, Caltech, Harvard axis of political scientists who I was exposed to back when I was an academic in some of those places. And the story here was that as members became more secure in their positions in Congress, which Morris Fiorina, now at Harvard, saw as starting to happen in the 1970s, the only thing that mattered to re-election was constituency service. And the more you were reelected, the better you got at constituency service, and you really didn't need the leadership. So a Congress of independent members appeared, each of which had to have his own particular interests served to get legislation passed. And I would also suggest that as far as the Christmas tree aspect of energy legislation goes, it's gotten worse. That EPAA was not a good bill. EPCA was a worse bill with efficiency programs and CAFE standards built into it. Natural Gas Policy Act was actually a pretty good bill as these things go. As we went on to EPACT of 1990 to ISA, that was probably the high point of Christmas trees in legislation, as they became more and more just a vehicle for serving constituency interests. Chris told the stories that I was going to tell about what happened with what was supposedly climate change bills, which morphed from the McLean-Lieberman bill, which had, a number of regulatory and subsidy measures built into it, to the Waxman-Markey bill, which was almost all regulatory and subsidy with a kind of a gloss of cap and trade on top of it. And then Barbara Boxer let the open Pandora's box by pointing out how many billions of dollars in allowances the Congress would have the capacity to allocate. But people kept remembering, no, this is actually trying to do something. There is going to be a cost imposed on somebody, and it turned out there just wasn't enough to hand around to get a majority plus one in the House, which they got, but then to somehow keep that majority and transform it into to 60 plus one in the Senate, which couldn't be done. I mean, we saw this even in Obamacare, which was maybe the last hurrah of the system when the deciding vote to give us Obamacare was bought with a specific constituency payout. So we get these much broader bills, but I would also suggest that up until now, they have created a great deal of mischief. But as I think Peter documents quite well, they really haven't changed very much. They have, in many cases, their primary objective, they have simply failed, spent a lot of money on demonstration projects, commercialized technologies, which just don't work. So we've wasted money. We've put in regulations, efficiency standards that have gotten much, much worse over the past 6 years, that probably really didn't make all that much difference to anything before that. Renewable portfolio standards, which are now tightening up to put the screws to electric generators and push, and that's just to stop at the point where it was in legislation. But so what can be done about this? Well, at least that's how I was going to put it. And Chris has already pointed out what's happened, which is that we haven't seen a bad piece of energy legislation since the energy provisions of the the ARRA back at the end of the George Bush's term.
2009.
Sorry?
2009.
2009, yeah. So 5 years without, or a little bit more than that, without a bad piece of energy legislation. Of course, we've seen almost no legislation of any kind. But I think that I have a couple of speculations about that. I think part of it is, obviously, gridlock. What's gridlock to one person is an effective use of checks and balances to another. So Congress has not been able to pass legislation that probably had bipartisan support. Portman-Shaheen is a good example of that. All of the rank and file in Congress were in favor of Portman-Shaheen. After all, it's about energy efficiency. What could be bad about promoting more energy efficiency? Couldn't get on the agenda because of the ideological blockage between the Senate Majority Leader and the House of Representatives. So it just didn't go anywhere. Thus, we have a Congress in which we have polarization now on top of the standard desire to provide constituency service. But we also have a leadership which has become progressively much more powerful than it was in the period from the 70s to the late 90s. And the power of the leadership seems to be associated with a couple of things. I would attribute it to the ability of the leadership to control the purse strings, and also the fact that an awful lot of incumbents lost their seats in the last 2 or 3 or 4 rounds of congressional and Senate races, meaning that those newcomers who have arrived there don't have the built-up power of the 6, 7, 8-term congressmen and senators, and therefore are dependent on the leadership to give them good things. Plus, the leadership just has a whole lot more money coming from the super PACs and the contributors to the Senate campaign committees and the House campaign committees. So they've been able to do something, but with the polarization, what has happened is basically that the leadership has been able to prevent kind of coalitions of members of Congress coming together for another energy bill to distribute pork. But what it's left us with is an executive power pursuing single-mindedly a radical agenda that will, in fact, lead to changes in energy markets, that we are now seeing things come out of the administration that will have much more influence on energy markets than any of the omnibus legislation that came out of Congress in the last 20 years. Makes some of us long for the good old days of energy bills that wasted money but fundamentally didn't change anything. And I am not sure that I can see the tide turning through intellectual arguments about plenty and prosperity, partly because I think there is a self-flagellating quality to the push for climate legislation and other restrictions on energy use and promotion of changes in lifestyle, but mostly because I think it requires institutional change, and it requires a Congress which is able to put restrictions on what the executive branch can do. And I'm not sure that I see a route toward that happening.
Thank you, David. Given the lateness of the hour, I think even though I had thought we might have a quick exchange of views here on the panel, and even though there are a lot of both common and somewhat contrasting themes that make me really want to continue this discussion among the three of you, I think it's best if we turn to audience comments and questions now directly, and then we'll try to allow 6 or 7 minutes at the end of the session for final comments from the panel. So do we have questions and comments from, those of you who have questions and comments, please identify yourselves first, and then go ahead and ask your question or make your comment. There's a person over here. Yeah, we got a microphone, Mark.
Hi, Mark Carr with Channel Design Group and Transportation Research Board and a few other things. What do you see, for anybody, as the relationship, for good or ill, between the professionals in the regulatory agencies and congressional staff?
I think that might be a question that you have more experience with than I do. I think, I personally, I don't really, I have some knowledge of the congressional staff being well, it's a hard question for me to answer. I don't. That's something you really have to be down in the trenches in order to have a really good appreciation of.
I think David will probably have something to say about this. I would say that the relationship is very close. It is very deep. I think that it has changed substantially in recent decades, and whereas the congressional staff were, well, in the times that I served in the government long ago, in the early 70s and early 80s, we were, I was in Republican administrations, and the Congress was at least one house Democratic, and we were quite attentive to, terrorized by our congressional overseers. And come to think of it, it was bipartisan. That was true in the Republican Senate as well. We paid a lot of attention to them. When they shot, we said, "How high do you want us to jump?" I think that I think that has changed, and that the fact that the real action is now in the executive branch, and Congress is less a legislative branch than a group of individuals who operate as individuals, as supplicants with special licenses to try to influence the course of the executive branch through regulation, grants, investments, one thing or the other. I see the executive branch clearly has much less fear of the legislature, and the hearings, the IRS hearings over the summer were an amazing demonstration of that. I mean, the executive branch does things that would have earned any executive official a contempt of Congress citation like that in the past. Nobody really seems to care. So I think that there's been an inversion. It's always been very close. You'll still see aspects of legislation if you get down into the details that require that sometimes it says certain decisions have to be cleared with the staff. So there's certain ways that Congress tries to insinuate itself into the operations of the executive branch. But executive branch managers, I think, have a lot more autonomy. They have to deal with Congress, but more as individual grant seekers and favor seekers than as people who have the potential to write legislation that could change your life.
David, did you want?
No, I think that's a very good answer.
Hi, David Bailey. I'm a consultant these days. I teach at Georgetown, but in a previous life, I worked for 30 years for ExxonMobil and other energy companies. I'm struck by what you've said in this sense. If you go back to 2007, clearly you guys think that Congress should have done something else other than what it did do about the increase in oil prices at that point. And maybe it should have done nothing, and maybe that was the right thing to do. But I'd ask you to think about how they would have sold that to their constituents. And then perhaps the second follow-up, if I can do it, is to say, given my experience of working with governments on energy policy around the world, I would say the U.S. is not that bad. There are plenty worse.
Peter, that's perfect for you, I think.
Well, yes, the the question of what government should have done in 07 was clearly nothing. In September, it looked like the EISA bill was dead, but a burst of increase in the price of oil and therefore the price of gasoline in I believe October, November, really changed the tenor of the debate, and then it became I need to get closer to it. Then it became a debate about what should be in it and how fast they could get it done. And in fact, I believe that most of the work was done in a kind of frenzy over about 6 weeks. And of course, it did absolutely nothing with respect to the price of oil, which was often the case. I mean, so that how would they have sold it of doing nothing? That the way they sold other failed energy bills. The other guys were at fault. We wanted, it was do nothing Democrats or do nothing Republicans. We just couldn't agree because they had such outrageous demands. They couldn't have really sold it, but they could have explained it. And in fact, as the year went on, and of course, in 2008, the price went up to $147. There were, again, efforts to have more legislation. The Democratic bill was, the Republicans had a bill that I characterized as being irrelevant, and the Democrats had one that I characterized as being potentially extremely harmful. And the price just kept going up and up. The government, by the way, as a side note in that story, kept buying oil for the Strategic Petroleum Reserve up through May, and the price of oil being about I think it was about $125, $130, when Congress said, you know, maybe we shouldn't be buying oil right now. Maybe we should be releasing the oil to maybe lower the price, especially since it was an election year and they were going to be running. But it was really a push to get this thing done. They were very pleased with themselves. It didn't work, but but we're saddled with it. The 07 bill is one that still has major impact on a lot of areas right now, and will continue to for a long time, I think.
RFS2 being a prime example.
You pardon?
RFS2 being a prime
RFS2
example.
being a prime example.
Yeah, I'd certainly go along that RFS2 is one of the worst designed pieces of legislation, in addition to all of the other problems with the lack of any purpose in promoting renewable fuels. It actually put in law a specific forecast, which by then you would think Congress would have known was not going to come about. But there's this belief that keeps being pushed that allowing gasoline prices to go up or causing gasoline prices to go up is political death. And it is certainly something that is held hypocritically by both parties. I was testifying on one of those pieces of legislation because I'd done a pretty large study of the bad effects of price gouging legislation, and I was in front of the Democrat from Michigan, I can't remember his name, from Pennsylvania, who was pushing the price gouging legislation. I was there with the chairman of the FTC, the administrator of the Energy Information Administration, and someone from the Department of Justice. All four of us were pointing out with different degrees of tact what a terrible idea the bill was. And I was being harassed just as heavily by the Republicans about how, the guys with trucks in my district can't afford to, go to work because, the price has gone up so much. And my response, well, would they rather pay for gasoline or not be able to get any at all if you put price controls in? So, it was the usual thing. It was quite bipartisan. I'm not sure that's the case. I am not sure that there is really any particular electoral merit that one gets by taking a position on something as broad as ISA, well, something as broad as doing something about gasoline prices. I think the Midwestern representatives were voting for RFS for provisions for very obvious reasons. I think that everybody else who wanted something in the bill was sitting down with the majority counsel in the Senate and in the House and putting what they wanted into the bill. And I don't think that there would have been any problem one way or the other about not voting to fix gasoline prices. I think that it was a voluntary measure to provide constituency service. So I really am suspicious now that this myth about gasoline prices and getting reelected actually holds.
Two more quick questions. Over there in the corner, please.
Leandra Bernstein. I work with the Russian press. Is this on? Okay. This is a question about energy exports, because there's been a lot of discussion about U.S. policy shifting to exports. But given what you've said about the regulatory problems, environmental issues, and then major legislative hurdles, what are the actual chances, in the view of the panel, that we can begin exporting energy, and specifically enough to achieve the geopolitical aim of offsetting Europe's dependence on Russian energy, if you could?
Could I try first and be provocative?
Sure.
Because I think that all it would take is a stroke of a pen. Both natural gas exports and crude oil exports could be authorized quite legally, constitutionally, and consistent with every piece of legislation if the president simply said it is in the national interest to export crude oil, everything goes. And if the president simply said it's in the national interest to export natural gas, everything goes. We don't need any action in Congress. I mean, you're right. H.R. 6 has been bottled up. It's gone back and forth in all sorts of ways. This is a presidential decision. Do I think it will happen? No. We have a president who is ideologically committed now to a very radical agenda, and I don't think he's going to do anything to promote that, despite the fact that they are both complete no-brainers at this point, because they're the last two pieces of decontrol that we haven't accomplished successfully. Right. Is this president going to do it? I don't see a chance in hell, even though it is probably the one win-win solution that we have that would both contribute to lower world oil prices and a better market for U.S. oil producers. I mean, it would accomplish both of those things because of the internal complexities of what's causing the problem. And yet, do I think it's going to happen? No. Anyone more optimistic than I am?
Well, I can't say I'm very optimistic. When they talk in Congress about compromise, I sometimes think, well, what would they give? What would the compromise be? And there would be a continuation of the various subsidies and programs like electric cars and so on that would be given a long lead time, and maybe something like there would be a promise of allowing especially natural gas exports. Do I see it happening? No. Do I see it as a possibility? Well, you know, if they're talking about compromise and bargaining chips, especially one that probably would not have much in the way of any political repercussions, I think it's at least remotely possible.
Let me make a somewhat broader comment. You refer, and correctly, because I think it's a major theme of our policy debate, to the geopolitical goals of easing export controls. One of the themes that I think I see in Peter's book is that the whole notion of using oil as a geopolitical weapon hasn't worked out very well, whoever was the proponent of that concept. The one really striking geopolitical fact, I think, in the last decade and a half, cited by a recent international relations theory book, to the effect that between the year 2000 and 2013, U.S. GDP as a percent of world GDP declined by 32 percentage points. That's the most fundamental geopolitical fact of the last 15 years. It's a real decline in U.S. relative power. And it's fundamentally based on a change in the relative size of the U.S. economy. The most important priority we can have with regard to energy, as far as the U.S. geopolitical stance is that, for heaven's sakes, base our energy policy more on the objective of actually supplying adequate quantities of energy at reasonable prices. And the notion that we're going to somehow change the geopolitical constellation by import policy or export policy or reducing oil dependence, I think is just a chimera. One last question. Okay, hearing none. Final comments from the panel? Peter?
Well, I want to thank my fellow panelists for the kind words that they had to say for my book, and they raised many very intriguing and important questions that I kept taking notes over here about from what they were saying, and I again feel that this has been helpful to me, and I hope it's been interesting and useful to all of you.
Chris?
Do you want to say anything more?
Haven't figured it out. It's like reading the menu. If you'll go first, I might be able to find what I want.
I'm brimful of thoughts. It was such a stimulating couple of hours. But I think that I suggest we leave Peter with the last. It's a magnificent book. I would add only that anybody who hasn't read this book should go out and buy it. It's on Kindle too, and there's a lot of learning in this book. The world has changed, but the lessons of this book are relevant to today.
I can't say anything beyond that myself.
You want to disagree? Get a little back and forth.
All right. Well, then let me close by thanking all of you for your attendance, especially at so late an hour. We appreciate it very much, and thank you to all of the panelists.